Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about a pencil mark. Not a sword, not a scandal, not a courtroom. A pencil mark in the margin of a handwritten manuscript. A single line drawn through a sentence that a 63-year-old woman had written in careful, deliberate cursive at a kitchen table in Mansfield, Missouri, sometime around 1930. And the archive tells us this much. Laura's manuscript did not move toward publication untouched. That small, quiet fact that her memory passed through another writer's hand is the beginning of a story that America has been sitting inside for nearly 100 years without fully knowing it. Now, before we go any further, I need you to hold on to 3 things as we move through this story together. 3 small details. Keep them somewhere in the back of your mind because I am going to come back to each one. And when I do, each one is going to land harder than it did the first time. The first is Laura's handwriting. Neat, personal, cramped from years of frontier living and farm ledgers and letters written by lamplight when the candle money ran thin. The handwriting of a woman who lived an enormous life and wrote it down honestly, raw, adult, and not designed for anyone's comfort. The second is Rose's typewriter. The steady, professional clatter of a machine owned by a woman who had already published biographies of some of the most famous men in America. A woman who understood editors, markets, and the precise machinery of what makes a manuscript publishable. A typewriter that would, over the next decade, transform what Laura wrote into something the whole country could hold. And the third, the detail that makes this story something more than a mother-daughter dispute over grammar, is a pencil mark in the margin. A small, quiet act of editorial shaping. The physical place where memory met machinery, and where the story America inherited began to become something different from the story Laura remembered. Hold on to all 3. We are going to need them. If this kind of history, the kind that lives behind the cover of your favourite childhood book, is what brought you here tonight, hit subscribe right now. We go deep here, every single time, and stay with me, because what I am about to show you is going to change how you read those books forever. Here is what most people believe about Little House on the Prairie. They believe a woman named Laura Ingalls Wilder remembered her childhood on the American frontier, sat down in her old age, and wrote it all out from memory, warm, honest, and largely as it happened. They believe the books are her voice, her words, her unfiltered gift to American children. They believe the name on the cover tells the whole story. And here is the part that is both true and not nearly the whole picture. Laura Ingalls Wilder did remember her childhood. She remembered it in extraordinary detail. The specific sound of wind across South Dakota prairie grass, the precise weight of a tin cup filled with creek water, the exact texture of the worn wooden floor in a one-room claim shanty in the middle of a Dakota winter that very nearly killed her family. She remembered in the way that people who have survived genuinely hard things remember. Not softly, not sentimentally, but with the sharp, sensory precision of someone who needed those details to stay alive. And she wrote them down. But what she wrote down first was not Little House on the Prairie. What she wrote down first was a manuscript called Pioneer Girl. And Pioneer Girl was something else entirely. It was adult. It was honest. It was the frontier as Laura had actually lived it. With debt, hunger, crop failures, Mary's blindness, the loss of Laura and Almanzo's infant son in 1889, and the years of farming catastrophe that followed their marriage that the published books would never fully carry. It was the memoir of a woman who had seen genuine hardship, and who was not, in her first draft, interested in softening it for anyone. That manuscript was sent to publishers, and it was rejected. Not because it was bad, because it was the wrong form for a market that did not know what to do with it. And that rejection, that quiet, devastating moment when an honest woman's honest memory came back in an envelope marked not quite right, is where the editing war begins, not with shouting, not with accusations, with a typewriter, a pencil, and a daughter who knew exactly what the publishing world wanted. Because here is what almost no one tells you when they tell you the story of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Her daughter was famous first. Rose Wilder Lane, born December 5th, 1886, the only surviving child of Laura and Almanzo Wilder, was, by the time the 1930s arrived, already a nationally published writer with real professional standing. She had written biographies of Henry Ford, Jack London, and Herbert Hoover. She had lived and worked in Europe, in the Middle East, in the literary capitals of the world, She had bylines in national magazines and relationships with editors and agents that most writers spend entire careers trying to build. She understood the machinery of American publishing the way a blacksmith understands a forge, not from the outside but from inside the heat of it. She also had opinions, strong ones, political ones, about self-reliance and individual freedom and the moral dignity of frontier labour and the deep American virtue of a family that survives not because the government helps it, but because it wills itself upright through sheer human stubbornness. These were not idle opinions. They were the architecture of a worldview that Rose was actively developing in those years, a worldview she would eventually lay out in full in her 1943 book, The Discovery of Freedom. And in approximately 1930, Rose's mother handed her a handwritten manuscript about frontier poverty, failed crops, near starvation, and a family held together by love and luck in roughly equal measures. Rose read it, and she picked up a pencil. What happened next is not a conspiracy. It is not a scandal. It is not even, in the strictest sense, a war, though there was tension and disagreement, and the particular strain that lives between a mother who owns the memory and a daughter who owns the machinery. What happened next is the most interesting thing in American literary history that almost no one knows about. Laura had the memory. Rose had the machinery. And Little House on the Prairie, the book that has never gone out of print, that was translated into dozens of languages, that ran for 9 television seasons, that became the shorthand for American frontier virtue and family endurance, and the particular warmth of a lantern-lit room on a cold prairie night. That book was built at the intersection of both. The name on the cover says Laura Ingalls Wilder. The pencil marks say something more complicated, and tonight we're going to follow those pencil marks all the way to where they lead. But first, I need you to feel what was at stake, because we are not just talking about 2 women and a manuscript. We are talking about a nation in 1930, sitting inside the worst economic collapse in its modern history, with families losing farms and homes and livelihoods they had spent their entire lives building. We are talking about a country that was, in that exact moment, desperately hungry for a story about a family that faced everything and held on. Laura had that story. She just did not yet have the form to deliver it. That is what the next decade was going to build. Slowly, through letters and drafts and careful revisions and one professional writer's steady, determined hand reshaping the contours of another woman's deepest memories. The result would feed a nation. But the cost of that shaping, what it kept, what it softened, and what it quietly left out, is the question this story asks. We begin at the beginning, with a woman at a kitchen table, a stack of handwritten pages, and a story that America needed but was not yet ready to receive exactly as she'd lived it. Picture a Missouri farmhouse in the autumn of 1930. Not a romantic farmhouse. Not the kind from a painting. Red shutters, clean fence posts, a cheerful curl of chimney smoke. A working farm. Rocky Ridge Farm, in the Ozark Hill Country outside Mansfield, Missouri. The kind of farm that smells like turned earth and wood smoke, and the particular damp of a wood frame house, where the drafts come through the walls if you do not stuff them right. A farm that Laura Ingalls Wilder and her husband Almanzo had been building, slowly since they arrived there in 1894 after years of failed farming in South Dakota, that neither of them much like to talk about. Laura is 63 years old. She's sitting at a table. She has a pencil, her own pencil, not the one we need to remember, and a stack of cheap tablet paper, and she is writing from memory. Not from a clean archive laid out in front of her. From memory, family history, and the record of a life she'd carried in her body for decades, in the hands, in the senses, in the precise world of a childhood that 6 decades had not fully dimmed. She is writing about a little girl named Laura, and she is not softening anything. Here is what the real frontier childhood of Laura Ingalls Wilder looked like. Not the television version, not the children's book version, but the version the historical record supports. She was born on February 7th, 1867, in a log cabin in Pepin County, Wisconsin, the second of Charles and Caroline Ingalls' 5 children. Her father, Charles, Pa, was a man of genuine warmth, genuine optimism, and a restlessness that was both his greatest quality and the source of most of his family's hardship. He moved. He was always moving. Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Iowa to South Dakota, following land claims and fresh starts and the particular American belief that the next place would be the place where everything finally worked out. It rarely worked out. The family lived in Kansas on land that was not legally available to them. The government removed them before they could file a proper claim. They endured the grasshopper plague of 1875 in Minnesota, which stripped their crops so completely there was almost nothing left to eat. They lived through the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 in De Smet, Dakota Territory, 7 months of blizzards so relentless that the supply train stopped running, and the town nearly starved, surviving on wheat ground in a coffee mill and twisted hay burned as fuel because the coal ran out. They faced debt, illness, and Mary's blindness in 1879, remembered in Laura's books as scarlet fever, though later medical researchers have questioned that explanation and pointed instead to a more complicated illness. What matters here is the result. Mary lost her sight and remained blind for the rest of her life. Laura's childhood was real, the cold was real, the hunger was real, the fear was real, and she remembered all of it. Pioneer Girl, the manuscript she was writing in 1930, does not read like a children's book. It reads like the memoir of a woman who survived. It includes things the published books would not. A near sexual assault on a young Laura by an older man she was working for, which she recounted plainly and without drama. It includes the raw edges of frontier racism, the attitudes toward Native Americans that reflected the complicated and often violent reality of settler expansion across territories that belonged to other people. It includes the loss of Laura and Almanzo's infant son in 1889, who lived only 27 days. It includes the house fire that destroyed the home she and Almanzo had built, and the years of drought and debt and crop failure that followed their marriage, a period of such sustained financial catastrophe that the couple eventually packed what they could carry and moved to Missouri with $100, a family loan, and a determination that is genuinely admirable and genuinely heartbreaking at the same time. She wrote all of that down, in careful, honest, unpretentious prose. The manuscript ran to hundreds of pages. It was the story of her entire frontier life, from the Wisconsin cabin of her early childhood through the Dakota claims of her young adulthood. It was raw, it was clear, and it was one of the plainest surviving accounts of American frontier poverty written by someone who had actually lived inside it. And it was not publishable, not as it was. Now, this is the moment where I need you to understand something about publishing in 1930, because without understanding what publishers wanted, you cannot understand what had to happen to Pioneer Girl to become Little House on the Prairie. The publishing world of 1930 had specific categories and specific expectations. An adult memoir of frontier hardship had to compete with other adult memoirs and find shelf space in a market that was, in that Depression opening year, extraordinarily nervous about what readers would buy. Publishers were not looking for raw adult autobiography from a 63-year-old woman nobody had heard of. They were looking for something they could sell with confidence, something that fits a known category, something with a clear audience. Pioneer Girl did not fit a known category. It was too adult for children's publishing and too regional, too plain-spoken for the prestige memoir market. The agents who saw it, including George T. Bye, Rose's own agent, who took a look at the manuscript at Rose's request, did not know what shelf to put it on. It went out. It came back. The rejections were polite in effect, but the meaning was clear. The manuscript had power, but publishers did not yet know how to sell it. What they were looking for, what the market was beginning to realize it desperately needed, was children's books. Specifically, children's books set in a recognizable, comforting American past. Books that Depression-era parents could hand their children at bedtime. Books that said, families have survived hard things before. They worked, and they endured, and they were held together by love. And so can you. That realization, that the form had to change before the story could be sold, arrived through Rose. Rose had been watching the manuscript. She had read it carefully. She had seen what her mother could not quite see from inside the memory, that the raw material was extraordinary, but the container was wrong. The story of Laura's childhood was not an adult memoir. It was, with the right shaping, the first volume of a children's series, told from the child Laura's point of view, warm in its framing, clean in its moral architecture, and structured to deliver one world at a time, one book at a time. Rose wrote to her mother. She wrote to the agent. She began the process, carefully, professionally, with the sure hand of a woman who had done this many times before for other people, of figuring out how to turn what Laura had written into something a publisher would actually buy. She typed. She revised. She suggested structural changes. She wrote letters that went back and forth between Missouri and wherever Rose happened to be living that month, because Rose was not a woman who stayed in one place, which is its own kind of dark irony given that her mother's entire story was about the consequences of a father who could never stay in one place either. And in that postal correspondence, those letters crossing state lines, those typed pages travelling by mail, those marginal notes and gentle redirections and professional editorial suggestions that were also, underneath, the advice of a daughter who loved her mother and needed her mother to succeed, the shape of Little House on the Prairie began to emerge, not from nothing, never from nothing, from Laura's memory, but through Rose's machinery. Here is the question the archive quietly asks, and it is not an accusation. It is a genuine puzzle that anyone who has ever loved a difficult story will understand. At what point does shaping become authoring? When is an editor a collaborator? When is a collaborator a co-author? And when the name on the cover belongs to the woman with the memory, what do we owe the woman with the pencil? We're not going to answer that tonight in a verdict. What we're going to do is follow the evidence. The letters, the manuscripts, the typed pages, the pencil marks, and let the record speak in its own careful voice. Because the record is more interesting than any accusation could ever be. Laura wrote from life, Rose wrote from craft, and the books they built between them in the hard, cramped years of the Depression, with publishers on one end and a family's financial survival on the other, became the most beloved children's series in American history. Both of those things are true, and both of those things are not the whole picture. The whole picture is where we are going. Here is something the Little House books never prepared you for. Rose Wilder Lane was not a quiet woman. She was not domestic, not deferential, not the warm prairie daughter, waiting patiently on a Missouri farm for her aging mother to need help. She was, by the time the 1930s arrived, one of the most travelled, most opinionated, most professionally accomplished women writers in the United States. She had crossed oceans. She had lived in Paris and in Albania, and in Tirana, Albania's capital when Albania barely had roads. She had interviewed world leaders and written magazine features that were read by millions. She had built, lost, and rebuilt her own career multiple times with a kind of relentless professional energy that does not apologize for itself. She was also, underneath all of that, a daughter. And the relationship between what Rose was professionally and what she was as a daughter, the tension between her national literary life and her tethering to a mother she both loved and found suffocating, is one of the most quietly charged dynamics in American literary history. It is also one of the most important things you need to understand about the editing war, because Rose's involvement in Little House was not only professional generosity, it was complicated, it was layered, it was the work of a woman who was brilliant and forceful and not always easy to be close to, helping a mother whose story she believed in, through a process that cost both of them something real. Rose was born in Dakota Territory in 1886, during the years when her parents' early farming life was collapsing around them. She grew up on Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, a farm that her parents had struggled to build from almost nothing, a farm whose financial precariousness was a permanent background note of her childhood. She was, according to biographers, a child who felt the weight of her parents' disappointment in a life that had not gone as planned. She left Missouri as soon as she could. She did not look back easily. By the 1910s, Rose was working as a journalist in California and building the career that would eventually make her famous. She wrote features. She wrote human interest stories. She wrote with a voice that was confident and propulsive and specifically designed to move people through a narrative without letting them look away. She was good at it, genuinely professionally good, and she knew it. In the late 1910s and through the 1920s, she wrote biographies. The biography of Henry Ford, published in 1917, was a serious piece of journalistic work that reached a large audience at a time when Ford was one of the most famous men in America. She wrote about Jack London. She wrote about Herbert Hoover. These were not soft celebrity portraits. They were researched, structurally confident books written by a woman who understood how to build a long-form narrative from the inside out. She also made money. At her peak in the 1920s, Rose was earning enough from her writing to help support her parents, which she did, regularly and substantially, sending money to Rocky Ridge Farm in a financial arrangement that gave her a kind of complicated authority in the household that mothers and daughters do not usually negotiate openly. Rose was, in several documented senses, subsidizing the conditions of her mother's later life. That financial dynamic mattered. It was one of the quiet levers of power in a collaboration that had no formal contract, no official credit arrangement, and no public acknowledgement of what Rose was contributing. But here is what made Rose more than a skilled editor. She was an ideologue. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Rose was in the process of developing one of the most committed and articulate cases for libertarian individualism that American political thought would produce in the 20th century. She believed, with a conviction that went to the bone, that individual human freedom was the highest value, that government intervention was the enemy of human dignity, and that the frontier experience of American history was the purest demonstration of what free people could build when left to rely on themselves and their own labour. She would publish that argument fully in 1943 in The Discovery of Freedom, and she later became known for fierce opposition to the New Deal, Social Security, wartime controls, and nearly every form of state power. But she did not keep those beliefs out of the manuscripts she was working on in the 1930s. She could not have, even if she had tried. When you believe something that completely, it does not announce itself as ideology. It feels like neutral good judgment. It feels like the right shape for a story. And so, when Rose shaped the Little House manuscripts, when she pushed them toward warmth, away from the darker edges of Laura's actual memories, toward a vision of frontier life as proof of self-reliance and individual virtue, she was not only making the books more publishable, she was also making them say something specific, something about what kind of American past was worth remembering, and what that past proved about what kind of country America should be. That is not a conspiracy. Rose did not sit at her typewriter cackling about propaganda. But it is real, and it matters, and the books that came out the other side of that ideological shaping became, in the hands of Depression-era Americans who desperately needed a story about surviving without help, something far more politically powerful than anyone quite intended them to be. Laura had the memory, Rose had the machinery, and the machinery, it turns out, was not ideologically neutral. Think about that for a moment. The most beloved frontier family in American children's literature, the family that taught generations of children that hard work and goodness and love are enough to survive anything, was, in part, a product of a political worldview that was being actively constructed at the same time the books were being written. Pa's optimism, the family's endurance, the quiet dignity of a people who asked no one for help and built everything they had with their own hands, these were real. Laura remembered them. She lived them. But the specific shape those qualities took in the published books, the way they were framed, the way the harder edges were softened, the way the family's genuine poverty was transformed into something warmer and more triumphant, that shaping had a hand behind it that was not only literary, it was political. And the America that absorbed those books during the darkest years of the Depression absorbed the politics with them, the way you absorb the flavour of a broth without noticing every ingredient that went into the pot. This is why the editing war matters. Not because Rose stole something from Laura. She did not. Not because Laura was a fraud who needed her daughter to write her books. She was not. But because the distance between what Laura remembered and what America read is not empty space. That distance is full of choices, editorial choices, structural choices, ideological choices, market choices, made by two women working under enormous pressure in a country that was hungry for a particular kind of story, in a decade when the right story could mean the difference between a farmhouse saved and a farmhouse lost. And understanding those choices, following them through the manuscripts and the letters and the pencil marks and the typed pages, is how you understand not just two women and a set of books, but how America builds the stories it needs to believe about itself. We are just getting started. In Chapter 2, we are going to open the manuscript box. We are going to look at Pioneer Girl, what Laura actually wrote, what she actually remembered, and what was in those pages that never made it into the published books. And the gap between the two versions is going to be wider, and quieter, and sadder than you might expect. But first, I want you to hold on to those three things: Laura's handwriting, Rose's typewriter, and the pencil mark in the margin. Because by the time this story is done, those 3 small details are going to have become something else entirely. The pencil mark, especially. The pencil mark is not just a line through a sentence. It is the place where memory stopped being private and started becoming myth. And America has been living inside that myth for nearly 100 years. Before Little House was warm, Pioneer Girl was sharp. Not sharp the way a well-crafted sentence is sharp. Sharp the way a memory is sharp when it hasn't been handled yet. When it still has the weight of the original thing pressing against it. When no one has decided what to call it or where to put it on a shelf. Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down around 1930 and wrote out her life. All of it. The parts that hurt and the parts that didn't. The parts that were embarrassing and the parts that were proud. The winters that nearly swallowed her family whole. The towns that dried up and blew away. The moves that never quite paid off. The years that turned around and started over somewhere new. She wrote it straight, the way a 63-year-old woman writes when she's not trying to be a children's author. She was writing her life, not a bedtime story. And the manuscript that came out of that process as Pioneer Girl was not warm. Think of a manuscript like a room before anyone's been invited over. The dishes are in the sink. The unfinished things are still out on the table. The wall where the paint chipped after a bad winter hasn't been touched up. It's a real room, maybe the realest version of the room you'll ever see, but it is not the room you present to company. Pioneer Girl was in that room. It covered Laura's life more broadly, more directly, and more painfully than any published children's book could hold. It was adult autobiography, closer to memoir than to fiction, closer to testimony than to story. It moved through decades instead of seasons. It named things children's editors were not equipped to receive, debts that didn't resolve, failures that didn't teach a lesson, fears that didn't make a person stronger. Publishing is polite that way. It can close the door on a manuscript while thanking you very warmly for sending it. The early responses to Pioneer Girl were, in essence, a polite door closing. Not because the material wasn't real, not because the writing had no value, but because the manuscript didn't fit cleanly on any shelf that existed. And in publishing, the shelf is not a metaphor. The shelf is the question. Where does this go? Who picks it up? Who hands it to their daughter? A manuscript without a clear answer to those questions doesn't get published. It gets returned. Here is the hard material around Pioneer Girl, some inside the manuscript itself, some preserved in the historical record around it, that the later books would have to decide what to do with. The first thing is poverty. Not the poetic, quietly dignified poverty of children's literature, where a family is simple and hard-working, and somehow fine at the end of every chapter. The poverty in Pioneer Girl had edges. It was the kind that made a family move, again, and then again after that. Charles Ingalls, Pa, the beloved figure of the books, was a man who tried and failed, and tried somewhere else, and failed again. Not because he lacked goodness, but because the economic ground beneath him was never stable enough to hold what he built. That is not a villain's story. But it is not the story of a man whose virtue was always enough either. Pioneer Girl carried the weight of that distinction. The published books would lighten it considerably. Then there was hunger, not the kind that becomes a morally useful lesson by chapter's end. Real hunger, extended hunger. The kind that sits in a house through a long Dakota winter when the supply trains can't get through, and the flour is gone and the family is eating whatever the brown bread situation allows. The annotated edition of Pioneer Girl, edited by Pamela Smith Hill and published by the South Dakota Historical Society Press in 2014, gives the historical context that helps us see how severe Laura's account of the hard winter of 1880-1881 really was. The Published the Long Winter shaped that experience into one of the series' most powerful volumes, but the raw account in Pioneer Girl carried it without the narrative architecture the children's book would eventually give it, without the structure that made hunger readable for a child without being traumatic. That is the problem with raw memory. It does not care where a bookstore puts it. There was illness too, and not the kind that resolves neatly. Mary Ingalls lost her sight, remembered in the books through the language of scarlet fever, though later medical researchers questioned that explanation and pointed toward a more complicated illness. Laura and Almanzo also carried their own physical losses. The infant son who died, Almanzo's severe illness and partial paralysis, and the relentless cost of doing hard work on hard land, with not enough money to cushion any of it. These were not neat dramatic beats. They were the texture of a life being worn down at the edges over decades. Then there was debt. And this is where Pioneer Girl became genuinely difficult for children's publishing, because debt in Laura's account was not a temporary obstacle on the way to a satisfying ending. It was structural. The Ingalls family operated chronically at the edge of what their land and labour could return. Almanso and Laura's early married years were particularly brutal. Failed crops, a fire that took their home, illness that came while they were still trying to recover from everything else. Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires, published in 2017 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2018, documents this period in detail that the published books compressed almost entirely out of view. The young couple who appears in these happy golden years and the first 4 years, the books that bookend Laura's young adulthood, were not living the hopeful frontier idyll the earlier books implied was waiting for them. They were surviving a financial catastrophe that would take years to stabilise, and even then, only partially. A true story can still be unsellable. And then there is the material that requires the most care to address honestly. Pioneer Girl contains Laura's memories of Native American people, memories that reflect the settler worldview of a child raised in the middle of violent territorial expansion. Pa's desire to push further west, into territory that was legally recognised as belonging to indigenous nations, was not unusual for the time. The Ingalls family's presence in Kansas, the setting later used for Little House on the Prairie, was on Osage land before that area had been legally opened to white settlement. Pioneer Girl does not present this with modern political awareness. It presents it as a settler child experienced it, as a landscape, as a fear, as a background condition of frontier life. What the later books did with that material, including the notorious wording that treated native people as if they did not count as people, carried that original settler perspective forward into print, where millions of children would receive it as simple frontier fact. Scholars including Fraser have written extensively about this. The archive does not allow us to pretend it wasn't there, in the original manuscript and in the cultural moment that made publication possible. These are the splinters, not metaphorical ones, the actual hard material that was in the room before anyone started moving the furniture. Here is the thing that doesn't get discussed enough, and it matters enormously. When Pioneer Girl was rejected, it was not only because the writing needed work, it was because no one knew what kind of book it was. Was it adult memoir? It covered too much time and too many places to have a memoir's focused arc. Was it regional autobiography? Possibly, but regional autobiography was a small market, and Laura Ingalls Wilder was not yet a name that sold books. Was it frontier history? Not quite. It was too personal, too domestic, too interior. Was it family history? Something close to it, but who was the audience? Adults who remembered the frontier themselves were no longer a large, obvious book-buying market. The children who would make the books beloved needed a different doorway into the material. The door closed, softly, professionally, but firmly. And this is where the shelf begins to matter, in a way it hadn't mattered before. Children's publishing in the 1930s had its own particular demands that were not soft, even if the books it produced were meant to be. Publishers needed stories that could be handed from parent to child, without either party being disturbed by what was inside. They needed warmth, not as a lie, but as a form. They needed a narrative that moved forward through time in a way children could follow, with a protagonist young enough to be a companion, not a witness to things a child shouldn't see. They needed a moral world that held, not false, not saccharine, but stable enough that a family buying the book felt they were giving their child something good. The frontier was not cozy before it was edited. This is the pressure that began to reshape what Pioneer Girl could become. The raw manuscript was not going to find a shelf as it was. But within it, buried under the adult chaos, the accumulated debt, the racial complexity, the physical wreckage, there was something that might work as a children's book if you were willing to do the dangerous work of separating one world from the other. The transformation that was coming, and we will follow it in detail in the next chapter, required specific, painful choices. The huge span of Pioneer Girl would have to be divided into smaller contained worlds. One location, one season, one stretch of childhood at a time. The adult Laura who wrote the memoir would have to step back and give her place to child Laura, the one who didn't yet know how the story turned out, who was still inside the experience and couldn't see the edges of it. That child Laura perspective is what creates the famous intimacy of the published books. That feeling of being right there, inside the warmth or the cold, without the narrator hovering above explaining what it all means. But that perspective was constructed. It required an adult to build it by deciding what a child would notice and what a child would not yet understand. The adult danger in the manuscript had to be shaped into scenes, given beginning, middle and end, because children need hardship to behave, not disappear, behave. A long winter can be in a children's book. What it cannot be is a formless, exhausting stretch of time with no arc, no lesson, and no resolution that a parent can feel okay handing to a 7-year-old. The difference between Pioneer Girl's hard winter and the long winter is not the presence of hunger. It is the structure that makes hunger into something a child can hold. The debt, the failed farms, the illness, the infant death, the strokes, these did not vanish from Laura's life. They were simply placed outside the frame. Not cut exactly, not lied about, put where the camera wasn't pointing. Pioneer Girl was not too weak, it was too raw. Here is the question the archive keeps asking quietly, on every page. When a hard memory becomes a children's classic, what happens to the hardness? Some of it becomes usable. The long winter exists because there was a real winter that nearly killed people. By the Shores of Silver Lake exists because Mary really did lose her sight and Laura really did become the family's eyes. The difficulty does not disappear. It becomes narrative, and that is not nothing. That is in fact what literature does at its best. It makes experience holdable. But some things become easier to believe in the held version than they should be. The idea that Pa's goodness was always enough. The idea that the family's hardship was always temporary and always survived through virtue and effort alone. The idea that the frontier was a morally clean space of opportunity and self-reliance, rather than a contested, violent, economically brutal landscape where the starting position of a family, the land they had, the capital behind them, the community network they could draw on, shaped the outcome as much as any amount of hard work. Rose did not open the door by knocking louder. She changed the shape of the thing trying to get through. Think about what that actually means for a minute. You have a manuscript. You have a story that is real, that breathes, that carries the weight of a life actually lived, and you have publishers who have already read it, weighed it, and said no, not because the material is bad, because the material does not fit any container they know how to sell. That is not a grammar problem. That is not a problem you solve by tightening sentences. That is a structural problem. And structural problems require a different kind of hands. What Rose saw when she looked at Pioneer Girl, and this is the thing that changes everything about how you understand what she did next, was not one failed book. She saw several possible books trapped inside one manuscript that didn't know what it was trying to be. Imagine a house with too many rooms added on over time, a kitchen that opens into a parlour that opens into 3 different bedrooms, and a root cellar, and a porch that faces the wrong direction. Every room is real. Every room has good things in it. But you cannot walk anyone through it cleanly. There is no front door that makes sense. There is no obvious path. That was Pioneer Girl. The life was there. The truth was there. The experience was extraordinary. But the architecture was a problem. And Rose, who had spent decades writing for newspapers, writing biographies, writing fiction for national magazines, Rose understood architecture, so she picked up the scalpel. Editing is not decoration. Sometimes it is amputation. And that distinction matters, because what Rose did here was not polish. Polishing is what you do when something is almost right. What Rose did was something closer to surgery, and not the comfortable kind with anesthesia and a scheduled recovery. The kind where the patient is awake, and the decisions are being made in real time because the market will not wait. The work that happened between Rocky Ridge Farm, Rose's correspondence, literary agents, and the publishers who eventually considered the material involved retyping, restructuring, rethinking the viewpoint, reconsidering the pacing, and doing the particular hard thing that published writers understand and first-time writers almost never do. Deciding what to cut not because it isn't true, but because the book cannot carry it. Every surgery leaves a scar. We'll come back to that. But first, let's talk about the hardest part of the whole process. Not the toughest conversation, not the most difficult letter, the hardest technical transformation of the entire project, turning an adult's memory into a child's voice. Because that sounds simple when you say it that way. And it is one of the most technically demanding things you can ask a writer to do. Here is the problem. Laura remembered everything. She remembered the adult dimensions of what happened. She remembered what it felt like to be a woman looking back on a childhood defined by poverty, by relentless movement, by the fear that lived in the spaces between good seasons. She remembered the debt. She remembered the years her father's crops failed. She remembered the weight of what her parents carried and never fully explained. Adult memory knows the whole room. It knows the smell of fear mixed with the smell of supper cooking. It knows the look on a father's face when the money isn't there. It knows what the silence after a hard conversation means, and that is exactly what a child narrator cannot know. A child narrator has to see the room from a lower angle, closer to the floor, focused on what is concrete and immediate and sensory. The sound of the fiddle, the texture of the cornbread, the particular quality of light through a greased paper window, rather than the adult meaning underneath it all. Laura remembered the whole room. Rose lowered the camera. That is the child-sized window, and it is not a simple thing to build. The Little House books feel intimate in a way that is almost uncanny when you read them as an adult. They feel like you are actually inside a small child's experience. The warmth feels warm, the cold feels cold, the fear is exactly as large as a child's fear is, and no larger. There is something about the scale of those books that makes them feel true in a way that adult memoir rarely achieves. But here is what you have to understand, that intimacy was crafted. It did not simply arrive by itself because Laura had good memories. It was built through a series of decisions about what child Laura could notice, what child Laura could understand, what adult meaning had to be withheld from the page even when adult Laura knew it perfectly well. A child narrator is not a child. It is an adult decision. The published books allow little Laura to feel hunger without fully understanding family financial collapse. She can sense that Pa is worried without knowing the specific arithmetic of debt and missed payments. She can experience the Prairie as beautiful and terrifying in turns, without carrying the adult knowledge of legal uncertainty, economic risk, and how fragile the family's future really was. That controlled innocence is one of the reasons the books work. But it did not come free. Building it required someone who understood what a child's perspective can hold and what it cannot, and who was willing to do the deliberate work of separating those two things on every page. Now here is where it gets structurally interesting. Because Pioneer Girl, even after the child's voice problem was understood, was still too large for one children's book. It was too large for two. Laura's life, compressed and carefully managed, was still a life. And a life does not have the clean shape that a children's novel needs. A children's novel needs a specific world, tight geography, a family with room to breathe on the page, the weather and a season and a set of problems that can begin, escalate and resolve, or not resolve, but at least arrive somewhere, within a reasonable number of pages. Laura's life had none of that built in. It kept moving. Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, each place barely settled before the next departure. Each claim barely broken before the next failure made it necessary to leave. That restlessness was the truth of the Ingalls family's frontier experience. But it made the narrative structure nightmarish. The solution, and this is where Rose's professional instincts show most clearly, was to divide the life into book-sized worlds, not to falsify it, to organize it into smaller contained worlds. One book, one place, one childhood stage, a Wisconsin winter, a Kansas prairie, a Minnesota creek and a dugout, and a first experience of school. Not every real move or hardship made it into the published sequence. Burr Oak disappears, some material is compressed, and the books shape life into cleaner book worlds. But each volume operates as its own emotional and physical universe. Each one has its own weather, its own threat, its own small arc of seasons. This is where the trunk appears. Think about packing for a long journey. Not a trip. A journey. The kind where the wagon can only carry so much, and everything that cannot fit must be left behind. You do not leave things behind because they aren't real, or because they aren't good. You leave them behind because the trunk has a finite size, and the road ahead requires you to choose. The revision process was that kind of packing. What made it into the trunk? Everything that gave the books their power and their warmth. The specific physical world of the frontier, the food, the weight of it, the cornmeal and salt pork and the wild plum preserves that tasted like summer preserved in a jar. The sensory texture of log walls, grass roofs, and the way firelight moves across a ceiling in a one-room cabin. Past fiddle and what it meant, that music was the one thing the family carried everywhere, because it weighed nothing and cost nothing and could fill a room without needing to be paid for. Ma's order, her absolute insistence on cleanliness and table manners, and the forms of civilization in places where civilization was barely a rumour. Laura's own sharp alertness, her noticing, her particular way of watching the world with both love and the quiet, unsentimental accuracy of a child, who has learned that things can disappear without warning. That stayed. All of it stayed. And that is why the books are still readable 100 years later. But the trunk could not hold everything. Here is where you have to be careful, because this is the part of the story that people want to make into an accusation, and it isn't one, or at least it isn't only one. The published Little House books are softer than the historical record of the Ingalls family. The debt is quieter. The failures are less catastrophic in their adult meaning. The near starvation of the Dakota winters, documented in the adult historical record, is present in the books, but it is given a shape that a child can hold. The racial politics of settler expansion, the violence of the frontier ideology that justified taking land from native peoples, the complicated and sometimes ugly cultural attitudes of the era. These appear in the published books, but transformed, compressed. Placed at distance, the child narrator can observe without fully comprehending. Some of that softening was the natural result of the child voice transformation. If little Laura can only see what a child sees, then adult complexity has to live outside the frame. Some of it was genre pressure. Children's publishing in the 1930s had very clear expectations about what it would and would not carry into a child's hands. A manuscript that required too much parental explanation to justify was a manuscript an editor could not place with confidence. Some of it, and this is where the question gets genuinely difficult, was probably ideological. Rose's belief in frontier self-reliance as a moral argument was not a neutral position, it was a conviction. And convictions have a way of influencing what details an editor finds essential, and which ones seem like unnecessary complications. We should be careful not to put every single one of these choices on Rose alone. The archive supports collaboration, not a simple story of one person controlling another. But the shape of what was folded away does align, in meaningful ways, with what the publishing market required, what the children's genre allowed, and what Rose's own ideological framework found useful. A cut is not always a lie, but it is always a choice. This is the part where the machinery of the publishing world comes in, and the publishing world has a wonderful way of making a rejection feel like a thoughtful conversation about aesthetic priorities. George By was Rose's literary agent, a New York professional with real connections to the major publishers of the period. The correspondence that passed between Rocky Ridge Farm, Rose's various addresses, and By's New York office forms part of the documentary trail showing how the manuscript moved from private memory toward published book. Letters went back and forth. Revised pages were mailed, physically mailed, typed pages in envelopes, carbon copies kept at each end of the correspondence. Suggestions came back from By and from editors. Those suggestions fed back into new revisions. Virginia Kirkus, who was then connected with Harper & Brothers' children's department, is recorded as having seen the material that would become Little House in the Big Woods. Harper's interest did not mean the raw manuscript could pass through unchanged. It meant the book had to become a children's book in form, not just in subject. Publishers do not usually carry scalpels, but their requirements have a way of sharpening everyone else's. The book that Harper eventually accepted in 1931 and published in 1932 was not the book Laura first imagined writing. It was the book that the collaboration, Laura's memory, Rose's structural judgment, the agent's market knowledge, and the publisher's genre requirements had assembled from the material that memory provided. That is not a scandal. That is how publishing works. It has always worked that way. But when the book that emerges is Laura Ingalls Wilder's name alone on the cover, and the labour of transformation is distributed across a letter trail that most readers will never see, It raises a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Where does editing become collaboration? This is the question that the archive keeps pressing. There is a spectrum here, and it is not comfortable at either end. On one end, you have the argument that Rose was merely a skilled typist and helpful friend, whose suggestions Laura could accept or reject freely. On the other end, you have the argument that Rose functionally authored the books and Laura's name was essentially a branding decision. Both of those are too simple. Both of them flatten what the evidence actually shows. What the evidence shows is something more uncomfortable and more interesting than either version. It shows two women, deeply bound by love and friction, and professional difference and economic need, working together on a manuscript that neither of them could have produced alone, and producing something that became, under one name, one of the most widely read pieces of American literature in the 20th century. Rose had professional craft Laura had not yet developed in book publishing. Laura had the lived world Rose could not invent. The question is not whether Rose touched the manuscript. The question is how deep the fingerprints went, and the honest answer is deep enough that the question is real, and not so deep that the question has a simple verdict. Here is the thing about the child-sized window that the narrative built so carefully. It worked. Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, and it found readers immediately. Readers in a frightened Depression-era America could recognize the warmth in those pages. Parents facing uncertainty could find something usable in a past that made hardship feel survivable. The window was exactly the right size for the moment America was living through, and the moment it worked, the next question arrived immediately. If this shape, the tight book world, the child voice, the sensory warmth over adult complexity, if this was the shape that worked, then the rest of Laura's life was waiting. All those other places, those other winters, those other failures and recoveries and departures, they were all still there. They all needed the same surgery, which meant the collaboration was not finished. It had, in some ways, just truly begun. The trunk that made Bigwood's work had shown exactly what could and couldn't fit. Now there were years of life still to pack, still to choose from, still to fold away or carry forward. Little House in the Big Woods was the proof of concept. What came after it was the real test of how far that transformation could go, and what it would cost to take a life that was complicated and adult and full of failure, and keep making it small enough, warm enough, and shaped enough for the hands of a child. Rose did not murder Pioneer Girl. She performed surgery. The patient lived. The scar became invisible, and that maybe is exactly why America mistook the finished book for something untouched. Think about what it meant to hold a book in 1932. Not to read for leisure, not to collect. To hold, the way people hold something warm when the room has gone cold and nobody's coming to fix the furnace. By the time Little House in the Big Woods landed in readers' hands in 1932, nearly 1 in 4 American workers had no job, and by early 1933, the number would reach roughly 1 in 4. Banks had been closing so fast that some families kept their savings in kitchen drawers, not because they trusted drawers, but because they no longer trusted banks. Farms across the Midwest and Plains were failing under mortgage pressure, collapsing prices, and drought. The same broad American farm world the Little House series would soon turn into memory, hardship, and myth. Families were moving, quietly and without ceremony, out of houses they could no longer pay for. And here, on a library shelf, was a book about a family with almost nothing. And the pages did not say despair. They said, "Keep going. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing." The Depression was not exactly a cheerful marketing department, but it did know how to create demand for a certain kind of story. Not the story of collapse, not the story of bureaucratic rescue. The story of a family that woke before dawn, worked until the light failed, ate what they made, and called it enough. Little House gave Depression-era readers something no policy pamphlet could easily give, the feeling that hardship had happened before to people they recognized, and those people had survived it with their dignity intact. A book does not become beloved only because it is good. It becomes beloved because it arrives when people need it. Imagine a lamp on a kitchen table in the early 1930s. Not electric, not guaranteed, not careless with money. A kerosene lamp. And someone has placed a book next to it, because the children need something before bed that is not the radio news, Not the neighbour's foreclosure notice slid under the door, not the sound of parents talking too quietly in the next room. That is the specific emotional role Little House stepped into. The books carried real cold, real hunger, real prairie darkness. Laura's family in the books is genuinely poor. They live in small spaces, they eat simple food, they depend on Pa's next good season to stay one step ahead of nothing. Biographers, including Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires, have documented that this poverty on the page was drawn from real financial precarity that shadowed the Ingalls family for most of Laura's childhood. The cold in the books is real cold. The hunger is real hunger. But, and this is the mechanism that made the lamp work, the hardship in the books is always inside a structure. It is never just suffering falling on people helplessly. In Little House, winter is hard, but Ma banks the fire. The pantry runs low, but Pa goes hunting. The crops fail, but the family sings in the evening anyway, Laura's small body pressed against Pa's side while the fiddle filled the room. Hardship was not removed. It was given better lighting. There is a specific kind of scene the books return to again and again, and if you grew up reading them, you probably remember it before I finish describing it. Someone is making something. Butter being churned, slow and repetitive, until the cream breaks. Cornbread browning in a cast iron pan. Maple syrup poured hot over fresh snow in a long golden ribbon. Crackers spread with the last of the jam. A Christmas candy that is only one piece, wrapped with enormous care, and eaten so slowly it lasts half a day. These are not just food scenes, they are arguments. Each one is quietly saying, this is what it looks like when work produces something real. Not an abstraction, not a quarterly report, not a promise from a bank that no longer exists. Bread. Actual bread that you made, with your hands, from grain that you grew or traded for honestly. For a Depression-era reader, and remember, many of those readers were adults passing the books to their children, reading over their children's shoulders, borrowing the library copy themselves. Those food scenes were not just charming. They were reassurance. They said that poverty could have order, that hunger could have ritual, that if you worked hard enough, correctly enough, with your family close enough, the table would not stay empty forever. The Depression made Little House feel less like history and more like instruction. Now, that is not a simple or comfortable thing to sit with, because the instruction had fine print. The bread tasted better in the books, partly because nobody mentioned who milled the flour. Walk into any scene of domestic life in the Little House books and notice what surrounds the food. A clean table. Not metaphorically clean, literally. Ma wipes the table. Ma smooths the cloth. Ma insists on manners even when there is barely anything on the plates. The children sit straight. Pa does not come inside with mud still on his boots if he can help it. There is a place for everything, and that place is maintained with real effort and real care, because in the Ingalls household, physical order is the visible form of moral order. This was not accidental in the books. It was one of the most emotionally loaded things the Little House series offered its readers, the idea that chaos could be managed from the inside, that even when the outside world, weather, debt, failed crops, long winters, was completely beyond your control, the table could still be clean, the family could still sit down together, Ma could still set out the dishes in the right order. For readers in 1932 and 1933 and 1935 who were watching entire economic systems come apart, institutions, structures, systems that were supposed to be permanent, that clean table was profound. It said, there is a domain of life that belongs to you, your home, your family, your habits, your work, and no financial catastrophe can take those from you unless you let them. That is the comfort, and it is real comfort. Built on real hardship, offered by a real woman's real memory. Don't mistake it for empty sweetness. It was never that. But order and chaos are not actually equal. A family can keep an immaculate table in a house they're about to lose to the bank, and the cleanliness of the table does not stop the foreclosure. The books rarely stay long enough with that kind of structural consequence. Their power is elsewhere. Rose Wilder Lane would go on in 1943 to publish The Discovery of Freedom, a book that historians of American libertarianism treat as one of the founding documents of that political tradition. Her ideology was real, documented and present in her life during the entire period she was helping shape the Little House manuscripts. But here is what made the books so effective as cultural objects. The ideology never arrives as ideology. It arrives as pay-splitting firewood. As Ma sewing a new dress from fabric they can barely afford. As Laura learning to sew a straight seam, to churn until the butter comes, to endure a long school day on an empty stomach without complaint, because complaint changes nothing and endurance changes everything. You did not have to be a libertarian to feel that. You did not have to be politically conscious at all. You just had to be someone sitting in a frightened house in the early 1930s, reading to a child by lamplight, feeling the books quietly insist. People can survive this. People have survived worse. Look, here is how. Politics were absorbed as feeling long before they were understood as ideology. And that is how culture does its deepest work. It does not always argue. Sometimes it feeds you for supper. Every lamp casts a shadow. And the shadow behind Little House is not small. The Ingalls family settled at one point on land in what is now Kansas, land that belonged to the Osage Nation. The books do not erase this. They show the Indians. They let a character say, out loud, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," a line that sits in the text of Little House on the Prairie like a splinter you do not feel, until suddenly you do. The wider historical record includes neighbours, government land policy, settler violence, and community networks. The books acknowledge that other people were already on the land, but the acknowledgement goes only so far. The Osage are seen from the Ingalls' doorway. They are not given their own story. The dispossession that allowed the Ingalls family to be on that Kansas prairie at all is not framed as a system. It is framed as landscape. This matters because the survival story the books tell, work hard, endure, earn your place, was built on ground that was not empty before the Ingalls arrived. The frontier that the books made survivable was survivable, in part because of decisions made at a government level that the books never examine homestead policy, territorial law, the forced removal of native peoples that opened the land white settlers moved onto. A family can survive through individual virtue. That is real, and the books honour it honestly. But individual virtue does not explain how the land became available to move onto in the first place. That part of the story had to stay in the shadow for the lamp to keep burning. Not because anyone consciously chose to hide it, because the books were built for children, because the form required warmth, because Depression-era America needed a frontier myth that felt survivable and morally clean, and that myth required a frontier that began, for the purposes of the story, when the white family arrived. The myth was not false in the simple sense, it was selective, and what it selected against was as important as what it kept. Here is the satisfaction loop the books built, and if you read them as a child you already know it in your body even if you never named it. A threat appears. Weather, scarcity, danger, illness, distance, isolation. The family recognizes the threat. The family works. Pa goes out into the threat. Ma holds the center. The children learn something difficult and do it anyway. The threat recedes. The lamp burns. The table is clean. The family is together. The child, Laura, small and watchful inside the story, survives. Every time. Not without cost, not without fear, but every time. The reader who comes back to that loop in 1933 is not coming back for nostalgia, in the soft decorative sense. They are coming back for rehearsal. Reading the survival of a fictional child was one way to practice believing that their own survival was possible, that families could hold, that work produced food, that a lamp on a table could mean safety even when nothing outside the circle of its light was safe at all. America did not just read these books. It needed the specific shape of reassurance they offered. Danger that resolves, hardship that dignifies, survival that confirms that you did it yourself. That need was the making of a myth. By the mid-1930s, something had shifted that goes beyond sales numbers. As the series grew, children, parents, teachers and librarians began treating the books less like isolated novels and more like a continuing family world. The Ingalls books, a place readers could return to. The series was reviewed warmly, placed in school collections, and gradually, without any single announcement, moved from children's fiction into the category of things Americans simply grew up with. The name Laura started doing something words usually cannot do. It became shorthand. Not for a single character or a single book, but for an entire feeling. The frontier childhood that was hard and cold and poor and good. The family that bent under pressure and did not break. The small girl watching a world that was beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, and surviving it, and remembering it, and somehow making the remembering feel like a gift. Readers were not only buying a book, they were buying a way to endure. The lamp worked. That is the fact Chapter 4 ends on. The warmth was real. The survival story was built from real hardship. The comfort was earned by books that did not lie about cold or hunger or danger, only about the depth of each, and the forces beyond the family that shaped them. But a lamp that warm, burning that long, with that many people reading by its light, eventually someone is going to ask about the parts of the room the light never reached. The myth was not false, it was shaped, and something was always left in shadow so the light could feel this clean. In the next chapter, we look directly at the shadow, the debt that wasn't there, the politics that ran underneath the floorboards, the history that had to be smoothed over so the table could look this clean. Because the most important question about a myth is never whether it comforted people. It is, what did it ask them not to see? Every comfortable house has a room nobody shows guests, not because the family is ashamed of it, because it's just down there, under the floors, under the warmth and the smell of good food and the light in the window, and as long as everyone stays upstairs, nobody has to explain what's in the cellar. That's where we're going now. There's a particular kind of American story that works like a beautifully composed photograph. You can see the family clearly, the father, the mother, the children standing in front of something they built together. The light is good. The faces are real. What they survived was real. You can feel it. But photographs have edges. They have a crop line. And everything the camera didn't include, everything just outside the frame, is as true as the family standing in the centre. Little House is a photograph like that. And to love it honestly, you eventually have to ask, what was just outside the frame? Start with something concrete, something that doesn't feel like an argument. Later in Dakota Territory, Charles Ingalls filed under the Homestead Act system, the federal law that offered settlers 160 acres of public domain land if they lived on it, improved it, and met the government's requirements. It was framed as free land. It was framed as a gift from a young nation to its hard-working citizens. What it was not framed as was this: land that required a federal bureaucracy to survey it, claim it, open it, and legally assign it. Land that required the United States government to have already extinguished, through treaty, force, or simply the fiction of emptiness, the claims of the people who were already living on it. The Ingalls family worked hard. That is beyond argument. Charles Ingalls woke before dawn, worked through heat and cold, moved his family again and again, chasing the possibility of a claim that would finally hold. The courage in those years was absolutely real. But courage alone did not make the land available. And that fact, that debt, government policy, law, railroads, markets, and removal all quietly shaped what a frontier family could reach, creaks under every scene of the books like a floorboard you hear but never name. This is where the house gets less comfortable. The Ingalls family did not survive entirely alone, not because they were weak, but because no family on the American frontier did. They bought on credit at the local store when the harvest ran short. The store existed because railroads carried goods out and supplies in. The railroad was there because the federal government gave massive land grants to railroad companies, which are more than 170 million acres by many historical counts, helping make Western settlement economically viable for capital that had no interest in the frontier for sentiment alone. When Laura was a child in De Smet, Dakota Territory, the town itself rose directly from the railroad's advance. The surveys, the lots, the lumber, the first shopkeepers, the infrastructure of frontier independence arrived on a train before most settlers did. The books include railroads and towns, but they rarely foreground the larger system behind them. Not as a fact the books deny. As a fact the books simply do not see, because the story is always inside the family, and the systems that made the family's survival possible are always off-stage. Self-reliance is easier to admire when paperwork disappears. Here is what the Little House books don't dwell on. After Laura married Ingalls Wilder in 1885, the couple's first years in Dakota Territory were an almost uninterrupted financial collapse. Ingalls suffered a severe illness that left him with lasting weakness and partial paralysis, from which he never fully recovered. Their infant son died in 1889, just weeks after birth, a detail absent from the published books entirely. A fire destroyed the house they'd built. Crops failed 3 seasons running. They took out a mortgage and couldn't hold it. By the early 1890s, they had abandoned South Dakota and moved, near broke and diminished, to Mansfield, Missouri, where they would spend the rest of their lives slowly rebuilding. That is the adult story that runs beneath these happy golden years and the first 4 years. Caroline Fraser, in Prairie Fires, 2017, documents this period with specificity that the books never approach. The Ingalls family's financial record was not a series of temporary setbacks overcome by grit. It was a sustained pattern of debt, failed claims, and dependence on credit, with no cushion, no inherited capital, no safety net other than each other. The books make that pattern feel survivable. That is their great emotional gift. But survivability is different from solved. Debt is not dramatic until it takes the house. In the Little House books, it never quite takes the house. In the historical record, it came very close more than once. That floorboard creaks under every scene. The myth just asked you to hear music louder than it. In Little House on the Prairie, the Ingalls family moves to Indian Territory in Kansas. Land the Story often lets the child reader experience as beautiful, open, and waiting. It was not empty. The land where Charles Ingalls built his house in 1869 was on the Osage Diminished Reserve. Osage rights and federal settlement pressure were still unresolved in practice during the very years the Ingalls family was there. What made the land available, or appear available, to settlers like Charles Ingalls was not open prairie. It was federal Indian policy, treaty violation, and the machinery of removal that had been grinding through indigenous communities for decades before the Ingalls wagon arrived. The family was ultimately asked to leave. They did leave. The book includes this, but frames it as Parr's decision, a matter of principle, a choice to do the right thing before the soldiers came. Biographers, including Fraser, note that the record is murkier and that financial pressure and the government's actions drove the departure as much as Charles Ingalls' conscience. What the books show is a family standing in the prairie. What the books crop out is the full history of how that prairie came to have a legal category that allowed a white settler family to claim it. This is not a conspiracy. Laura was a child. She remembered what a child sees: grass, wind, the sound of her father's fiddle, the weight of loneliness and beauty mixed together on an enormous plain. She did not lie about what she saw. But the final form of that memory, shaped by Laura's selectivity, Rose's editorial hand, and the publishing pressures of the 1930s, produced a story that placed the family in the centre of the photograph and let the history of the land outside the frame. The photograph was real. The crop was the myth. This has to be said carefully, and it has to be said. Little House on the Prairie contains a line, spoken by a neighbour, Mrs. Scott, that reads, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Laura, as the child narrator, registers horror. Her mother does not echo the words, though she does not challenge them either. Laura, as the child narrator, registers discomfort. She does not agree with her mother in that moment. The scene is not presented as a celebration of violence, but the line is there, embedded in a book that millions of children read as a document of family virtue, and it reflects the full weight of settler ideology, the casual logic by which indigenous presence was categorized as obstacle rather than humanity. Scholars, including Anne Ramines and Kim Tallbear, have written about what the Little House books do and do not do with indigenous people. The pattern is consistent. Native characters appear at the edges of the story, defined largely by their relationship to settler movement, threatening it, coexisting with it, or being cleared from its path. Their own lives, histories, grief, and political reality exist entirely outside the frame. That is not an accident of a child's limited perspective. It is what settler mythology required the frontier to look like, a landscape being claimed rather than a landscape being taken. Rose's libertarian conviction that individual settlement rights were the foundation of freedom did not introduce this blindness into the books. It was already in the cultural air of the era. But it did nothing to interrupt it, and its ideological celebration of frontier independence made the framing feel like virtue rather than a mission. A family can be brave and still be inside a system. This is the part that requires the most careful attention, because it is not about anyone doing anything wrong. It is about how myths transmit themselves. Children who grew up reading Little House absorbed, without being lectured, a set of propositions about how the world works. That hard work is the primary engine of survival, that families are self-contained moral worlds, that government exists mostly as an irritant or a threat, land officers, surveyors, school inspectors, rather than as infrastructure that made settlement possible, that poverty is a test of character rather than a structural condition, that the frontier was fundamentally available, a space of freedom, not a space of contested sovereignty. None of these propositions were delivered as arguments. That's exactly what makes them effective. They arrived as feeling, in the warmth of a firelit evening, in Pa's fiddle, in the smell of Ma's bread, in the quiet confidence that a family working hard would be okay. Rose Wilder Lane believed these things with intellectual conviction. She published The Discovery of Freedom in 1943, the same year Laura's last book published during her lifetime appeared. A libertarian manifesto that argued individual freedom, not collective action, was the engine of all human progress. But the books did not need Discovery of Freedom's rhetoric. The same worldview was already in the emotional grain of the novels, woven in so finely that readers felt it before they could name it. This is not propaganda in the crude sense of a lesson forced on a reader. It is something subtler and therefore more durable. It is the seasoning you taste before you realize someone added it. Here is what the Cellar holds: federal land policy, treaty violation, removal, debt structures that trapped frontier families in cycles they couldn't outrun, market prices set by buyers in Chicago and New York, not by families in Dakota Territory, railroads built on government subsidy, not frontier individualism, community labor, barn raisings, seed loans, credit at the store, without which isolated settlement was not sustainable, regional relief efforts and public policies that shaped who could keep going and who could not, neighbors who carried families through blizzards and illness and failed harvests. All of this was real. All of it shaped what became possible for the Ingalls family and for the hundreds of thousands of settler families whose lives followed the same structural patterns. The books are not wrong to center the family's courage, love, and endurance. Those things were real. The warmth was not invented. The family was not fake. But the story trained generations of readers to feel that individual virtue was the primary explanation for survival on the frontier. The cellar, where the debt lived, where the policy decisions lived, where the dispossession lived, was always there. The myth just kept the children upstairs. That is not a lie. That is how myths work. The Little House books became something beyond children's fiction. They became available as a cultural argument, the kind of story people could use in debates about government dependency, frontier values, and the moral dignity of self-sufficiency. The self-reliance myth that the books carry did real cultural work in the 20th century. It gave frontier poverty the emotional shape of dignity rather than structural failure. It made individual endurance feel like the whole story, when the historical record shows it was always only part of the story. And that's not Laura's fault, and it's not Rose's fault in a simple sense. Both women were operating inside the assumptions of their era, their market, their moment. What they produced was genuinely beautiful and genuinely shaped. The problem only comes when the shaping is forgotten, when the photograph is mistaken for the whole landscape, when the cellar is sealed up so completely that a later generation can't remember it was ever there. Self-reliance sounds cleaner when the paperwork stays off stage. Seeing the shadow does not make the light worthless. The Little House books contain something irreplaceable. The specific, sensory, emotionally true memory of a real childhood lived in real places, with real people, under real conditions. The feel of prairie grass, the sound of Pa's fiddle, the smell of wood smoke in a winter kitchen, the quality of attention a child brings to the world before she knows what to be afraid of. No historical analysis extracts that from the books. It is there, and it is Laura's, and it belongs to every reader who has ever felt it. But loving them honestly, as adults, as citizens, as people who understand that stories shape how we see, requires being willing to go down into the cellar, to sit with what the myth asked us not to name, to understand that the Ingalls family's courage was real, and was also surrounded by systems, policies, failures, and histories that the warm room upstairs was never designed to contain. The house was real, the warmth was real, the cellar was real, and a myth becomes most dangerous not when it exaggerates, but when it teaches you so thoroughly where not to look, that you forget after a while that there was ever anything to find. So here is the question the Cellar leaves us with. If the myth required this much shaping, memory selected, edges cropped, debt softened, ideology seasoned in, community support rendered invisible, dispossession moved outside the frame, then who exactly made it? Whose hands are on this story? Laura's name is on the cover. But we've been watching, across every chapter, how the thing on the cover and the thing in the manuscript are not quite the same. We've watched memory become manuscript. We've watched manuscript become form. We've watched form become myth. And somewhere in that chain, somewhere between an old woman's handwritten pages and a nation's bedtime story, a question has been building that we haven't answered directly yet. Who gets credit for what these books became? That's where we're going next. The name on the cover is real. Let that land for a second, because the whole conversation that follows depends on it. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about her life. She wrote it from memory. She wrote it with her body's full knowledge of cold and hunger, and the particular sound of a fiddle on a winter night in a house with no insulation and not enough food. That name belongs there, but a cover is designed for a reader. It is a front door, and front doors are not architectural blueprints. They do not show you who poured the foundation, who framed the walls, who measured the rooms, who decided to move a doorway 3 feet to the left because the light came in wrong. The front door says welcome. It does not say here is everyone who built what is behind me. The name on the cover is Laura Ingalls Wilder. The archive opens the second door. Here is the question that has been building since we first looked at those manuscripts, and it is not a question about theft or fraud or who deserves to be famous. It is a simpler, more honest question, and it is genuinely hard. When two people work on a book, one of them with the memory, one of them with the craft, and only one name goes on the cover, what exactly is true and what exactly is missing? Both of the simple answers to that question are wrong, and they are wrong in ways that matter. The first simple answer is the internet version, the one that travels in dramatic video thumbnails and Reddit threads. Rose secretly wrote the Little House books. Laura was essentially a figurehead. The name on the cover is a publishing fiction. That answer is emotionally tidy. It has the satisfying shape of a reveal, the particular pleasure of discovering that a beloved thing was not what it appeared. It is also not what the archive shows. The archive shows a mother with an irreplaceable world inside her, the specific physical reality of frontier childhood that no one else on Earth could reproduce, the sensory authority of someone who actually lived in a dugout and survived the hard winter, and knew what a tin cup of creek water weighed in a cold hand. That world was Laura's. It could not be invented. Rose did not have it, could not have had it, and the books do not exist without it. The second simple answer is the defensive version, the one that protects the books by minimizing what Rose did. Rose typed some drafts, offered a few professional suggestions, and Laura made all the real decisions. The editing was modest. The books are essentially Laura's alone. That answer is also wrong. And anyone who has spent time with the correspondence between Rocky Ridge Farm, Rose's various addresses, and the agents and publishers involved in producing the Little House series knows it. Publishing loves a single author because complicated mother-daughter collaboration under financial pressure does not fit neatly on a cover. But the correspondence does not care about what fits on a cover. The correspondence is messier and more interesting than either version of the story. So here is what the archive actually supports. Laura Ingalls Wilder brought to these books something that cannot be quantified in editorial terms. She brought the world. Not a rough sketch of it, not a vague impression of frontier childhood. She brought the precise, embodied knowledge of someone who had slept in those places, eaten those meals, worn those clothes, feared those winters. When little Laura in her little house in the big woods notices the way firelight moves across the log walls of the cabin, that noticing comes from a woman who lay in that cabin as a child and burned that image into herself so deeply that 60 years of distance couldn't soften it. When Pa's fiddle fills a room in the books and the cold outside seems for a moment less absolute, that warmth is Laura's. She grew it. She kept it. No amount of craft can manufacture what she carried in from a life actually lived. The books could not exist without her. That is not a polite thing to say. It is the structural fact of the entire project. But here is what Rose brought, and this is where the second chair comes in. Imagine you have set the table. You've put everything out, the food, the plates, the years of work that went into making it, and then you realise the room has no door that a stranger could walk through. The table is real. The feast is real. But without someone who knows how to build doorways, no one outside your own family ever eats. Rose knew how to build doorways. And by the time Rose began working seriously on the Little House manuscripts in the early 1930s, she had spent roughly 2 decades understanding what professional publishing required at a structural, not a decorative level. She had written biographies of Henry Ford, Jack London, and Herbert Hoover, long, researched, confidently constructed narratives for a national audience. She had placed work with major American magazines. She had a literary agent, George T. Bye, and a working relationship with the publishing machinery in New York that Laura had no access to and no particular instinct for navigating. Rose did not simply retype her mother's manuscripts and mail them to Harper. The documented evidence, letters, revised drafts, correspondence with editors and agents, shows structural involvement. She worked on pacing. She worked on narrative arc within individual books. She understood how a children's series had to build, how each volume needed to function as its own emotional world, while also being part of a larger sequence that readers would return to. She had a market sense that came from years of professional practice, and she applied it to manuscripts that Laura, who had never published a book before, was producing for the first time. Virginia Kirkus, then connected with Harper & Brothers Children's Department, was part of the publishing world that recognized the material's potential only once it could be shaped clearly for young readers. Harper's interest did not mean the raw manuscript could pass through unchanged. It meant the book had to become a children's book in form, not just in subject. Rose understood those conditions. She could translate them into practical revision in a way Laura, working in Mansfield, Missouri, largely without publishing industry context, could not have done alone. This is not a ghostwriter story. A ghostwriter replaces the source. Rose did not replace the source. She was more like, and this metaphor is imperfect, but it is honest, a master baker who received the wheat already grown, already harvested, and whose real skill was knowing what temperature the oven needed to be, how long to let the dough rise, and which parts of the loaf needed to be shaped by hand before it went in. The wheat was Laura's. The baking knowledge was Rose's. You cannot eat the wheat without the baking. You cannot make the bread without the wheat. Neither of those facts cancels the other. The seam between them is where the question gets genuinely difficult. Think about how fabric is joined. 2 pieces of cloth, each real, each with its own texture and weight. A seam is where they meet, and a seam done well by someone who knows what they're doing is almost invisible. You have to look closely to find it. You have to turn the fabric over and look at the back. In the Little House books, the seam between Laura's memory and Rose's craft is largely invisible. That is why so many readers, for generations, have never felt the join. The books read as a single voice. They have a consistency of tone, a specific intimacy, an emotional register that feels entirely unified. Little Laura is always the same child in the same perceptual world, noticing the same kinds of things, missing the same kinds of things, experiencing the same quality of wonder and fear and warmth. That unified voice is not an accident, and it is not only Laura's. It is the product of someone doing the seam work carefully enough that the join disappears. Rose's specific contribution to that voice, to the pacing of chapters, to the management of what child Laura notices and what she doesn't yet understand, to the book-level architecture of how one scene leads to the next, was more than incidental. Scholarly biographers, including William Holtz, whose 1993 biography The Ghost in the Little House argued for a more substantial Rose contribution, and more recently Caroline Fraser, whose Prairie Fires in 2017 engages the question with considerably more nuance, have examined the letter trails and manuscript evidence in detail. Their interpretations differ in emphasis. Holtz argued Rose's role was so extensive that co-authorship undersells it. Fraser's position is more measured, acknowledging real and significant collaboration while respecting Laura's authorship of the foundational material and her ongoing engagement with the books throughout their production. Both are working from the same archive. They reach different places. That is what the archive does. It does not issue verdicts. It issues evidence. And evidence without a verdict requires something harder than resolution. It requires sitting with complexity. The comfortable answer, one author, one name, one clean story, is not available, but the sensational answer is not available either. Here is what we can say with confidence, based on what the documentary record supports. Laura's role as the source of the lived world is the strongest fact in the whole debate. The sensory authority of these books, the specific physical reality of the frontier childhood they describe, comes from her memory and from her alone. She was also, throughout the series, an active participant in its production. She read drafts, she negotiated changes, she had opinions about what was right and what was wrong and how her life was being shaped for publication, and she exercised those opinions. She was not a passive figure handing over a manuscript and walking away. The books came out under her name because, in the most foundational sense, they were hers. Rose's role as one of the people who made the books publishable, shaping not just surface polish but structure, voice, pacing and manuscript form, is also strongly supported by the documentary record. The collaboration was real. It was ongoing. It involved more than encouragement and light copy editing. Rose brought professional craft to manuscripts that needed professional craft, and she brought it in ways that left marks on the finished books that any careful reader of the correspondence can trace. What we cannot say with confidence is the proportion. Where exactly does Laura's voice end and Rose's craft begin? The seam is real, but the best seams disappear, which is precisely why the question is still being asked 90 years later. And here is the part of the story that nobody in publishing was particularly interested in discussing while Laura was alive. The labour of shaping someone else's work into publishable form is real labour. It takes time, skill, professional knowledge, and a considerable amount of nerve, because to tell someone that their memory needs structural surgery is not a comfortable conversation to initiate, especially when that someone is your mother and the memory is her whole life. Rose did not receive public credit for that work. Her name was not on the covers. She was not named in the reviews. When the American Library Association created its Lifetime Achievement Medal in 1954 and made Laura its first recipient, the public honour belonged to Laura's name and Laura's literary legacy. Rose's contribution was not part of the public story most readers were given. This was not unusual. Editorial labour in the early 20th century, particularly editorial labour performed by women on books published under another woman's name, was culturally categorised as support rather than authorship. The cover had room for one name. History, inconveniently, had room for more. Women's editorial work has a long tradition of near invisibility. Max Perkins, who edited Hemingway, Fitzgerald and Woolf, is celebrated as one of the great literary editors of the century. His name is in biographies, in documentaries, in university courses. The equivalent labour performed by women, often on books that were less culturally prestigious to begin with, rarely received that acknowledgement. Rose's situation was not unique. It was structural. Publishing allocated credit the way society allocated most things in that era, to the person whose name the market found most usable. Laura Ingalls Wilder was the clean public image the books could carry, the pioneer woman remembering childhood for children. Rose's role would have complicated that image, maybe not destructively, maybe not scandalously, but definitely messily. And publishing has never loved mess when a simple cover story is already working. That is not a conspiracy. It is just how the machinery ran. There is a second chair at the authorship table. It has always been there. The question has never really been whether Rose sat in it. The correspondence makes clear she did. The question is what label goes on the chair. Not author, not ghostwriter. Neither of those fits. The most honest label available, and it is an imperfect one, is creative collaborator under conditions that made public credit inconvenient for everyone involved. Rose was working in her mother's material, with her mother's knowledge, toward a product that her mother needed to succeed for financial reasons that were real and pressing. She was applying professional skills that her mother genuinely did not have. She was doing work that made the books what they became, and she was doing it inside a family relationship where the power dynamic, the financial arrangement, and the emotional stakes were all tangled together in ways that no standard publishing contract was designed to address. If editing were only commas, editors would be much less feared by writers. Rose was not only managing commas, she was managing the distance between a raw, honest adult woman's memory and the specific, warm, contained world that a children's publisher in Depression-era America was willing to put on a shelf. The chair is not empty because Rose was erased. It is empty because the cover only had room for one name, the market only had appetite for one story about authorship, and the particular kind of labour Rose performed was the kind that American publishing culture in the 1930s had no good system for honouring. The second chair does not remove Laura from the table, it makes the table honest. There is a version of this story that wants to end with a verdict. Rose wrote it, or Laura wrote it. Someone lied, someone was wronged, someone deserved something they never received. That version is more satisfying as a YouTube narrative. It has the structure of an accusation and the catharsis of a resolution. But the archive is not in the resolution business, it is in the evidence business, and the evidence, read carefully, supports something more uncomfortable and more interesting than any verdict: that the books were genuinely built by two women, that the seam between their contributions is real and largely invisible, and that the system that put only one name on the cover was not designed by either of them. It was the water they were both swimming in. Laura gave the books their world. She gave them the cold, the fiddle, the weight of a tin cup, the particular quality of light through a greased paper window on a Dakota winter morning. No amount of craft can make that up. It was hers. Rose helped give that world publishable form. She helped decide what the door looked like, where the windows went, and which rooms the reader was allowed to walk into. That work was real, and it cost her something, and it never got its name on the cover. The cover was not false. Laura Ingalls Wilder gave the books their life, but the second chair was never empty. Rose Wilder Lane helped give that life its shape, and the seam between them, almost invisible because it worked so well, is where one family's memory became something America could hold in its hands and call its own. Which brings us to the final question. Not who made the books. We have taken that as far as the archive allows. Laura gave the memory. Rose helped shape the form. Publishing gave the rules. Readers gave the books permanence. But once a myth is made, once it leaves the women who built it and enters classrooms, television screens, family shelves, politics, nostalgia, and national memory, who owns it then? That is Chapter 7's question, and it is bigger than two women and a set of manuscripts. It is the question of what America did with the story it was given, and whether it is possible to love something more honestly once you know how it was made. By the time Little House belonged to America, it no longer belonged to the women who made it. That is not a tragedy. That is what myths do. They leave their makers. They move into kitchens, classrooms, family shelves, and eventually into the bloodstream of a culture's idea of itself. The story stops being about two women in Missouri wrestling over manuscripts and becomes something bigger and harder to hold. A national room that millions of people entered as children and never quite left. The question this final chapter is asking is not how the books were made. You already know that. The question is what America built with what those women handed it, and whether we can still love the thing that got built once we've seen the blueprints. Picture a library shelf in the mid-1940s, any town, any state. The war has just ended, and the world is reorganizing itself, trying to remember what ordinary life feels like. On that shelf, spine out and ordinary as a glass of water, sits Little House in the Big Woods. Near it, on the banks of Plum Creek. Near that, the Long Winter. A growing row of books, already beginning to feel less like separate volumes and more like a place readers could return to. A child reaches up and pulls one down. She has not been told about the editing. She has not been told about the rejected manuscript or the Depression-era publishing market or the ideological current running quietly through the prose. She has been told nothing except that these books are good. And so she opens the first page, and the Wisconsin woods arrive, and the firelight comes on, and the world inside the book is warmer and more orderly than the world outside it. This is how myths work. They do not announce themselves. They get into you through the ordinary gestures. A library card, a teacher's recommendation, a grandmother's gift edition with the cover worn soft from handling. The child does not absorb a cultural argument. She absorbs a feeling. And that feeling, once installed in childhood, becomes almost architectural. It holds things up. Later it becomes very hard to question, without it feeling like someone is trying to knock down a wall you've been leaning on for years. The library shelf does not ask permission to become furniture. It just stays there, year after year, edition after edition, waiting for the next hand to reach up. Here is something worth sitting with. A significant portion of Americans who think they know Little House have never read the books. The NBC television series that premiered in 1974 and ran until 1983, 9 seasons, with Michael Landon as Charles Ingalls, gave the myth a second life that was both wider and softer than the original. Landon's Charles Ingalls was warm, wise, dependable, and almost preternaturally capable. The Ingalls family on screen was poor but never desperate, challenged but never broken, and emotionally resolved in ways that frontier families, including the real Ingalls family, almost never were. This matters because the television version became, for many viewers, the primary Little House experience who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s. Not the books, the show. And the show had its own relationship with the source material. It moved the family to Walnut Grove and kept it there, stabilizing a family that spent their actual lives in near constant motion. It gave Charles Ingalls a warmth and authority that the historical record suggests Charles Ingalls was still working to earn through most of his adult life. It made the frontier feel like a neighborhood. That is not a criticism of the show as entertainment. It is an observation about what television does to myth when it takes over. It smooths, it holds still, it gives the story a face that replaces the page, and once that happens, the myth is no longer just what the authors intended. It is now what Landon's face said every Friday night for 9 years. The books are still on the shelf, but the image walking through many people's memories is standing in a sunlit field, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, steadier and cleaner than the historical man could ever be. A nostalgia built on top of an already edited memory, 2 layers of warmth between the reader and the cold ground underneath. Nostalgia has excellent manners. It always wipes the table before hiding the bill. At some point in the late 20th century, Little House became more than a beloved children's series. It became a political vocabulary. Commentators and politicians across the ideological spectrum found in the Ingalls family a ready-made image of what America was supposed to be: self-sufficient, hard-working, government-independent, morally upright, and unbothered by collective structures. The frontier family as argument. The pioneer homestead as proof of a thesis. This was not entirely accidental. Rose Wilder Lane, who helped shape the books, was by the time of the series publication developing the libertarian philosophy she would articulate in The Discovery of Freedom in 1943. Her deep conviction that individual freedom and self-reliance were the defining virtues of the American experience ran through the texture of the books she helped craft. Not as propaganda inserted from the outside, but as a genuine ideological temperature, a warmth that came from how she understood the frontier and what she believed it meant. By the time later generations picked up those books and handed them to their children, the ideological temperature was invisible. It just felt like the right way to describe frontier life. The Ingalls family didn't need government help because they didn't need government help. That was the story. And a story told often enough, to enough children, over enough decades, stops needing to argue. It just becomes the natural shape of things. America is very good at turning children's books into national policy arguments, which is probably not what most librarians signed up for. The myth did not belong to one political position forever, but it was useful to certain positions in ways the books could not entirely resist, because the books had been shaped by a worldview that made self-reliance feel intimate, moral, and natural. Here is what is true before anything else. Millions of people love these books for real reasons. The love is not confused. It is not naive. It is earned by what the books actually contain. The sensory precision of a cheese press, the weight of a quilt, the smell of dried hay, the specific tension of waiting for a blizzard to pass in a house that has almost no food left. Laura's lived world comes through on the page with an intimacy that no amount of editing can manufacture from scratch. The warmth is real. The beauty is real. The detail of a particular American childhood at a particular moment in the frontier is documented and irreplaceable. And it matters that someone wrote it down. For many readers, especially women who first encountered these books as girls, the attachment runs deeper than content. It runs into memory itself. The books were there at a particular age, and that age is sealed in. Reading Little House is not the same as reading any other book about the frontier. It is returning to a specific room inside your own childhood, and the room is warm and the light is good, and the sound of someone reading aloud is still in the walls. That is the real thing. Do not let anyone take it from you by calling it simple, but a hand-me-down coat can be warm and still not fit everybody. These books were written by and about white settler families moving across land that had been and was being dispossessed from indigenous peoples. The native characters in the books, particularly in Little House on the Prairie, are rendered in language and with attitudes that later generations of readers and scholars have documented as dehumanizing and sometimes openly hostile. The books do not hide this. It is present on the page. For many native readers, the warmth that the books extend so generously to the Ingalls family does not reach them. They are outside it. They are, in the text, something to be moved through our past rather than encountered as full human beings. The coat was made in a particular era, by people with a particular worldview. It fits some people. It does not suit everyone, and the people it does not fit are not wrong for saying so. They are just standing in the cold, telling you what they feel. There is a specific experience that happens to people who loved Little House as children, and then return to it as adults with different eyes. It is not betrayal. It is not outrage. It is something quieter and stranger. The experience of walking back into a childhood room and noticing that the room is smaller than you remembered, and that there are things on the shelves you never looked at closely, and that the light coming through the window falls differently now, and in the light you can see something floating. Dust. Fine and ordinary and always there. You just never had the angle to see it. Later readers and scholars brought that angle. Carolyn Fraser's Prairie Fires, published in 2017 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize, placed the Little House story in full historical and economic context. The land dispossession policies, the failed homesteads, the debt structures, the gap between what the books said about frontier life and what the land records showed. The Pioneer Girl Project, published in 2014 by the South Dakota Historical Society Press under the editorship of Pamela Smith Hill, put the original Pioneer Girl manuscript in front of readers for the first time, alongside scholarly annotation, making the distance between Laura's raw memory and the published books visible and measurable for anyone who wanted to look. What those works found was not a conspiracy. It was a gap. The gap between the full story and the story that got through. Between what the frontier actually cost, in dollars, in indigenous lives, in failed crops, in debt that broke families, in land policies that benefited speculators more than homesteaders, and what the published books chose to keep in frame. The dust was not created by criticism. Criticism only made it visible. And here is the thing about dust in a sunlit room. It does not mean the room is worthless. It means the room is real. A room without dust is a sealed room, a preserved room, a room nobody has lived in. The Little House books are not a sealed room. They are a lived one. They have been touched by too many hands, carried into too many childhoods, given to too many daughters by too many mothers for them to be anything other than deeply, messily, genuinely human. But the questions that critics and scholars and native writers and historians have raised over the last 3 decades are not attacks on the room. They are the consequence of someone finally turning on a light that had been off for a long time. A book can survive childhood and still fail adulthood if we refuse to reread it honestly. The modern reassessment of Little House has not been simple or clean. It has included serious scholarly work, and it has also included the performance of outrage that the internet specializes in, neither of which is quite the right response to a complex and deeply embedded cultural legacy. The books are not a recruiting poster. They are not a pure document of innocent American virtue either. They are something more uncomfortable. A genuinely beautiful, genuinely incomplete, deliberately shaped artifact made by 2 women working under real pressure in a particular historical moment, which then got picked up by a culture that needed it and used it in ways neither woman could fully control or anticipate. What do you do with that? You do not throw it away. A book that has lived inside this many childhoods, that has given this many people a language for what they love about work and family and landscape and endurance. That book is not erasable, and trying to erase it would not correct the omissions inside it. It would only remove the conversation. You do not protect it from questions either. The protection is the problem. The insistence that Little House must be received as innocent, as clean, as untouched truth rather than shaped memory and selective myth. That insistence has done more damage to the books than any critical reading. It has asked readers to choose between love and honesty, and that is a false choice. It is always a false choice. Reassessment is not arson. It is turning on the light. The shelf does not need to be emptied. It needs to be read with the lights on. The pencil marks were real. The sharp manuscript that never quite made it to publication in its original form was real. The surgery that turned adult memory into a child's voice was real. precise and necessary, and leaving its traces in the text for anyone who knows where to look. The lamp that the books held out in dark years was real, and the warmth people felt was not a trick. The cellar full of things the published story chose not to enter was real, and the second hand that shaped the manuscript, that left its professional signature across the structure and the tone and the ideology of the finished work, that hand was real, and it deserved acknowledgement before it got it, and it has earned its place in the story now. All of it was real. All of it happened at the same time, in the same house, between the same two women, shaped by the same economic pressures and the same emotional tangle, and the same national appetite. The myth was not simple when it was being made. It is not simple now. It was never going to be. The strange thing about Little House is not that America loved it. America has always been good at loving a story about itself. The stranger thing is how America kept living inside it, kept returning to that firelit room, kept pressing the books into children's hands, kept building a national self-image from the image of a family in a small house on an enormous prairie, for nearly a century, without ever quite asking what was outside the frame of that image. What was outside the frame was not nothing. It was land policy and debt, and indigenous communities pressed into the margin of the story. It was the gap between one family's survival and the structures that made survival easier for some than for others. It was the labour of a daughter who typed the myth into being and left her name off the cover. It was the full account of what the frontier actually cost, which is different from the account of what it built. But here is what must be said, slowly and without apology. Laura's memory mattered. It was real, and it was irreplaceable, and without it there would be no books, only theory. Rose's shaping mattered. It was professional and deliberate, and it turned private recollection into a form that millions of people could enter, and that is not nothing. That is, in fact, considerable. America's need mattered. The hunger that received those books, the families who read them aloud in hard years, the children who found in them a proof that people could hold together under pressure, that need was honest, and the comfort it found was not false. The myth's omissions mattered too, what the story chose not to hold on to, the full weight of the debt, the full presence of the people who were already on the land, the full picture of how much luck and policy and starting position shaped who survived the frontier and who didn't. Those absences were not random. Some were decisions, some were genre limits, some were market pressure, some were the blind spots of the world Laura and Rose inherited, shaped by what a culture was ready to receive. They do not make the books evil. They make them human, and humans making decisions under pressure, leaving things out, reaching for the warmth instead of the whole truth. That is not a Little House problem. That is a very old human problem. The dust was always in the room. The light is just better now. So here is the only question left, and it is not a complicated one once you stop asking the books to be innocent for you. Can you love something and see it clearly at the same time? Can you hold the firelight and the cold ground in the same hand? Laura gave America memory. Rose helped give it shape. America turned that shaped memory into a room millions of children entered for warmth. The room was real. The warmth was real. But warmth is not the same as the whole story, and the whole story does not have to destroy the warmth. It only asks you to see what else is in the house. The shelf can stay. The books can stay. But now, when you open one, you know it is not a window onto an innocent past. It is a hand-me-down, worn soft by use, warm against the cold, stitched by specific people with specific hands in a specific moment in American history. You can wear it. You should wear it. Just know where it came from. Know who made it. Know who it was made for and who it didn't quite fit. That is not the end of love. That is where love grows up.